So Nicola, what is portfolio planning?
So first, I'm going to focus on events specifically, but you have to remember that events are part of something bigger. I'm a marketer, and an event is really one touch point along a customer journey. And we often get really stuck when we're talking about measurements and outcomes on attribution, first touch, last touch, who gets credit for the customer
Yeah.
and or the customer converting to a sale, whatever the metric might be. And I think that's kind of ludicrous, first of all, because that's like saying you decided to marry your spouse 30 days after one particular dinner. We know that's not how life works. So you have to think about events as a bit part of a customer journey and part of a campaign. Every touch point works together, and the messaging needs to be the same and aligned across those touch points, or else it just becomes chaos for the customer across their journey. So I just wanted to preface that before I talk about events. And to your question, what is event portfolio planning? It is really about understanding the needs of the organization, the needs of the customer base or the attendee base throughout their life cycle. Because when you're talking about a net new prospect versus an existing customer that's got millions of dollars of business with you, their needs are two different things. It's about understanding those two things and finding the right balance, and then designing a portfolio to meet those needs. So if your organization says, I need to build a portfolio of events that's going to fill the funnel with new opportunities, with new contacts, with new names, you're going to focus much more on third-party events, trade shows, whatever terminology you want to use, versus building a customer conference. Because nobody's getting on an airplane to attend your customer conference if they don't already
Yeah.
know you. Right. So it's
Mhm.
really about understanding what do you need to achieve, and then what are the right events type, and then what are the specific events within that type that you include in the portfolio.
Got it. Now, that's a good rundown. I think, funny enough, it is fairly simple, right? I
It
think
is.
sometimes people are just not taking the time to go through the motions of sitting, we said, with stakeholders and saying, hey, like, what are the needs of the organization, right?
Yeah.
And that's the first thing you touched on. What are our initiatives, right? What are our goals? Is it a revenue goal? Is it a leads goal? Are there activities we're trying to accelerate to create things that work down the line? Like, what is it? And then I think the thing that people miss all the time is the needs of the audience. Too many people are showing up to exhibit or do an event the way that they want, the way that they feel their product or service represents, when really it's about the audience, as you were mentioning. And then I love what you're saying around taking those two things and then saying, hey, look, like, if it doesn't line up with these two, we don't need to be at these events. What are we doing there? Because that's the question, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what are we doing there?
Yep, exactly. And you can have multiple competing priorities, right? So you've got the entire customer life cycle. So that's one. You go to market across different geographies. You go to market across different personas, across different industries. So all of those things are important to understand, and the prioritization of them as well. And I always say to my customers, focus on two. You can't really focus well on any more than two of
Oh,
those things. Pick two. And so if you want to focus on early stage awareness in X specific industries, focus there. That's very clear and helps you really build the right portfolio of events.
do you think that trying to dial it in and niche it down as much as possible and be specific is an advantage to companies when they're planning?
I think so, but it all depends on the organization, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they have really broad aspirations. And as event professionals and as marketers, we need to focus on where we can drive impact. We can change organizations. We can ask the right questions. We can't drive impact across every area of the business. So it's really about focusing and figuring out where can you make them that most impact.
We had an interesting conversation prior coming on. Tell me, with your practice, with what you do with your clients, was there like a light bulb moment? Was there anything specifically that like you did, an outcome was created, or things just went the right way where you were like, man, this is really working. Like, this is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. And I'll give you one really concrete example. And it was from when I was consulting before. We were at an event
Okay.
that was a partner event because certainly in the tech world, and I think in many other industries as well, we have partners that they've sponsored our event, we're expected to sponsor their event as well. And so this particular event, we had a 10 by 10 little booth that we were exhibiting at. And normally I wouldn't have wanted to go. That wasn't a worth sort of an event that warranted my presence at. It wasn't a really big activation where I had a lot of executives and so forth. But this particular event, I'd missed my flight sitting at the hotel bar. Oh, the airport bar.
There you
Missed my
go.
flight. So it gives you an idea of what I was doing. But anyway, so I ended up going back to the trade show and I was sitting in the booth and I watched this customer come up and talk to one of our people that were working our booth, the staff, and then we'll talk about staffing in a second, working the booth. And he said, yeah, I'll have so-and-so follow up with you. That's great. Didn't take a note. Next person came up, next person came up, next person came up. That person that he had said, we're going to have follow up with you, was long gone, long forgotten. And I
Mm.
was like, well, this kind of defeats the object of why we're here. And especially if you
Yeah.
promised an outcome to this person. So I spoke with the person, he was a sales engineer. And I said, is it always like this? He said, oh, it's so difficult to have a conversation. We're so busy. And I said, well, that's really interesting. So we created a whole different staffing plan. I wasn't savvy enough in the technology to be able to understand what was important in a conversation or not. I would have been like, what do you want me to put in the notes? But we created staffing plans where we matched the sales engineers with inside sales reps. And they worked in teams. They were incentivized as teams to have meaningful conversations. Meaningful conversation meant a conversation, not a lead. It didn't have to be a lead, but it's a happy customer. And to document that conversation, we took all of the BANT type questions, all of those complex forms that we have people fill in on the scanners, and just to document the conversation. We had a 386% increase in direct opportunities that were created out of the next event because of that staffing model. So to me, that was just like this one aha moment was so pivotal in the way that actually
Yep.
still to this day that I approach a third party event.
I really like that because I always find myself when I get into these conversations, I think the high level, broad stroke, like, hey, know your why, know your audience, do this is great. And I think it's so pivotal and people don't do it. But as you go down the funnel more, the details matter. And what's interesting is I did an interview. It was Nancy Toohill. She's with LexisNexis. She's their global event marketer. And we're having a conversation. And she was saying to me, I thought it was so cool what she said. She was like, doing events the right way is so hard and it's a lot of work. So it's these details of like when you're in the booth, do you have a plan for qualifying? Do you have a plan for following up? Do you have like you're doing all this work, spending all this money to be there. Let's say you did your portfolio planning, you did all this stuff and you're at the right places. You could just go screw it up. Most people would because they don't have a way of tracking leads. They don't know how to qualify. They don't know how to follow up. Gets lost in the shuffle. It's amazing. The details matter. And there's so much work to be done to execute leads at a high level. I love that story.
Yeah, or staff aren't engaging. How many times have you been to
Yep.
events that you walk around and they're talking to each other, not trying to engage with people that are walking into the booth? I mean, that's my biggest pet peeve to this day. But yeah, so you're right. Any piece of the process can mess up. But that's why I always say start with your outcomes, because then it'll allow you to design the plan to drive the right outcomes.
You know what I've learned about what you just said, because I walked more show floors years ago than I have now, but when I noticed that for always frustrated me. You have the people reaching out in the aisles to get traffic. Hey, do you need, and it just becomes this weird market, right? But what I've learned now is the companies that they don't have the traffic, they don't have the meetings, they don't have the engagement. They're sitting on their phone, they're eating lunch out in the thing. They just look disorganized and sloppy. They didn't put the work in.
Right.
They didn't put the work in prior to drive the traffic, to get their customers there, to create engagement, they didn't put the work in. It's a lot of work to get there to have that. And when we've prepared like that, you have this sense of feeling like you have to be ready. Like, oh my God, I put all this work in. Now, if people show up, I got to be ready for them. I can't, be on my phone or sit around. And yeah, I learned that
If
a
you
long time
build
ago.
it, they will come is not true.
That's yes.